I much respect the way you phrase that, because if I should say so myself, and I'm no scholar, of course, as everybody knows, I'm just a host. I listen to enough of this information to pick up things. And for me, I guess just going along what you're saying here, Dr. Ehrman, he's being as professional, and there's a lot of things I see that he uses to weigh in his ideas. It's not just being critical. If all these other brilliant people, and there is a mainstream consensus of brilliant scholars throughout history who've pointed these things out, he probably has some influence in that aspect as well. I mean, there's probably more than just let's be hypercritical about it. Of course, why he would say this is hypercritical. But I wanted to touch on something here, because I've been reading his basic version of Forged, the general populist version of Forged lately through audible.com. I feel like your Amazing Colossal Apostle is like this, the skeptical version of Forged, so to speak, and at least with the epistles. I would love to see you write a book, you know, piggybacking off of Forged, and of course it would be a massive manuscript dealing with the New Testament, all 27 books. I could see that being your magnum opus. I mean, like a legitimate skeptical scholarly approach on all 27 New Testament books, showing how unbelievably controversial. And of course, you quote so many scholars with different angles. That would take you a very long time, I suspect, even come close to writing something like that. But
well, actually, if you read I'm sort of like a Jekyll and Hyde on this. In the pre-Nicene New Testament and more in the Amazing Colossal Apostle, I do tackle every Pauline epistle, well, all the New Testament epistles in pre-Nicene New Testament with a critical approach, and in pretty good detail in the Amazing Colossal Apostle, and then in let's see, in Bart Ehrman Interpreted, I do talk about the falsification business and how odd it seems to me that he exempts these canonical epistles, and I try to show why it's not silly to take the Dutch radical position. So there are places where I deal with that. And then my Hyde side, or maybe this is the Jekyll side, in the third volume of Holy Fable, which is subtitled The Epistles and the Apocalypse Undistorted by Faith. There I deal with each Pauline epistle sort of in the Ehrman framework. I say that all of these things are paradigms for seeing what sense can be made of the text, looking through this lens and then this one. In these other books, I've taken the Dutch radical approach, but here I want to show what the epistles would seem to mean if you do take the standard view of the lucky seven being authentic. And in the footnotes, I occasionally say, well, this does look kind of peculiar and leads me to the Dutch radical view, but I try to explain what sense can be made in the standard critical approach. And of course, it makes a lot of sense. That it's not stupid. And I think it may be contrived, but it's not just like the good guys, except the Dutch radical view. So I try to show in these different books totally different ways of interpreting and understanding these books. I don't know if anybody's ever done that before. That might be a new one.
No, that's what's unique about what you're doing, and I have a ton of respect for this view, because I had a question I wanted to ask you, and I'm just now reminded of this because no one else does this the way that you do it, and you're actually my favorite when it comes to this kind of stuff. And first of all, if you're watching this and you have any way, shape, or form of reaching out to Joe Rogan, get Dr. Bob on Joe Rogan. He needs to get on there, because I heard and he asked the wrong guy, Bob. He asked the wrong guy. Joe was asking Richard Dawkins right, whether he thought Jesus was, a real person, like he really existed. And of course, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying we can all give our opinion. Anybody can ask him to do that. My point was saying, get the guy who literally you have been fired shots at you, your entire career has been pow, 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 you're a radical, you're a nutcase, you know, from the mainstream. Get
Well,
the
the
guy.
nutcase, they could be right. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I love it though. That's what I'm saying. We need to get you on Joe Rogan's podcast and let him ask that question and have you give some good points. I'm sure there'd be some good stuff there.
By the way, he asked Richard Dawkins, who certainly didn't discount mythicism. He just said ultimately it doesn't really matter much, and I agree with him there. But he and I were both at a conference. What the heck is it called? I forget. It was in Canada a few years ago, and I gave a talk about mythicism and the basis of it. And he was in the audience, and afterward came up and congratulated me on it and said he thought it was really good. So he's certainly not just a stick in the mud opponent of this.
Be cool to have him on a show with you one day.
Oh, yeah.
I would enjoy that. I'd enjoy anyone that we can get this information out there and make it more public, because everybody who's into this stuff sees the points we're making. At least be agnostic on the approach. Dr. Bob, let me ask you, honest. This is not an academic approach. This is going to be just a personal one. Do you ever have your days you wake up and you say, you know what? There's certain evidences that maybe make you pull back and go, damn, there probably was a Jesus. Do you ever have those moments where something hits you, or the way someone mentions something, it kind of goes, you know, there probably could have been this guy. You ever have that happen? Those moments still happen to you? Or are you like well beyond that and so skeptical on the approach that you're like, I'm not saying there couldn't have been, but nothing has even swayed you in a way where you wake up and you go, damn, he's probably a radical, you know, that was completely whitewashed. Do you think that sometimes?
Yeah, I think, well, just recently, I guess I came closest to that reading Creating Christ and thinking of how that could easily connect with Brandon's earlier hypothesis. They're both based on the idea of a pacifying, Romanizing picture of Jesus, and that seems to me to fit best with there having been a Jesus who was some sort of Che Guevara character. So that has made me consider it more seriously. But still, on the other side of the question, the obvious similarities to the mystery religions and Gnosticism and all that still seems to me to overbalance it. But then again, you know, I admit it could go either way. But that's the thing that, oddly enough, I know Fahey and Valiant don't say this, well, this proves mythicism. They're very careful not to say that. But if you tack it on to Brandon, that implies, yeah, there must have been a Jesus who was whitewashed. And so I'm not absolutely convinced, but I really got to take that seriously. So say that's the closest thing.
I mean, if it's not that there was a guy, let's speculate, because I enjoy this question. I know it doesn't matter at the end of the day in terms of nobody to me walked on water, nobody rose from the dead, nobody's killing these people doing these things, my opinion. But it is a fascinating question. And with that being said, at the bare minimum, let's suppose you don't say there was a guy. Could this not have been easily an archetypal, like an opposite archetype of the picture of all these rebels that were going on? I mean, Acts kind of paints that picture of the Egyptian, and then you had Judas the Galilean, and it's like, here's the antithesis. Let's do the opposite, actually. I mean, of what we got here, and create a archetype of a peaceful Messiah in the face of. So technically, he's fictional, yet he is now the opposite of. And you don't have to say there was a real guy there. I mean, for how many times have you seen scholars, even myself? I come to the conclusion that Jesus is Israel. Many, many times he is Israel, so to speak. It's like he's not this individual. He represents this this bigger picture.
Kind of like an Uncle Sam character.
Yes, exactly that. So I just wanted to throw that out there. Maybe that is where you sit to some extent.
Well, that was the view, I believe, of William Benjamin Smith, one of the great early modern mythicists, and I think he took the crucifixion business to denote the fall of Jerusalem and the fate of the Jews. That I'm not, and I'm pretty sure I've heard other people say that too, but that doesn't seem all that cogent to me. Anything's possible, but even that wouldn't have lasted long, because once the Christian movement became more Gentile, they're not going to care that much about. I mean, they believe they were the true Israel, but I don't. I kind of doubt that, but who knows? Um,
Yeah.
Tough to say.
So you wrote something on preterism, and you mentioned maybe you could talk about that, because I heard you once say on a podcast, you said, the difference between preterists and where I'm at in terms of mythicism, at least in terms of you being skeptical. Preterists say Jesus already came back. The idea that he actually, the final, not partial
Mhm.
preterists, not the guys who say, look, we believe there was a shadowed return in 70 AD, but the final culmination and all the elements, literally, the earth literally will be burned with fire, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas full preterists see this allegorical language, or they see it as apocalyptic language, and it's actually talking about the temple. It's temple language. It's Margaret Barker style temple language, discussing the second temple's destruction in Israel, wrapping things up. Now, with that being said, mythicism is, you're saying, look, I don't think he came at all. I mean, like, there was no even
Uh-huh.
coming to begin with. Um,
Yeah.
but when it comes to, because that's how far back you start digging into it. In terms of preterism, though, where do you agree? And are you aware of like full preterism?
Yeah.
Okay, so what do you think of that? Like, is it too much harmonization, or do you think some of the text are full preterist text, and that some of them are like, dude, they're trying to push this thing off into the future? There's a huge confusion of when the end is supposed to really happen, or
Well, I think the canonical version of the Gospel of John reinstates a future second coming, but the Gnostic original, minus the ecclesiastical redactor, did have a fully realized eschatology, which is kind of like preterism. There's not going to be. One of the disciples of the Last Supper says, "How come we're going to see you, but the world isn't?" That implies that, yeah, the Christians are wrong who think there's going to be future second coming, because like Karl Barth pointed out in John, it's not quite clear what is the second coming and what is the resurrection, which is a kind of a second coming. Jesus is dead now, but he comes back a few days later, and that's it. The kingdom of God has dawned. I mean, that's a common thing in the history of various religions, that they have a literalistic, apocalyptic expectation. Too much time goes by, and they say, well, I guess it happened without us noticing. That's what Jesus says explicitly in the Gospel of Thomas. They ask him when the kingdom of God will arrive, and he says, what you expect has already happened. You just don't recognize it. And in the Baha'i faith, the same sort of thing. You're waiting for the Mahdi. He's already come. There just weren't the fireworks you expected. I remember hearing Seals and Crofts talk about this on the Mike Douglas show millions of years ago. He says, tell us about your religion, the Baha'i faith. And he says, well, people are waiting for the second coming of Christ, but we think it's already occurred. In Baha'u'llah, the founder of the Baha'i faith, what? And little did I know this was, it happened many times in religion. And preterism has an unintended consequence. For one thing, it leaves an open-ended history. There's no, you're back in ancient Judaism then. I mean, let's say in the time of the prophets and all that, where who knew what would happen? History is going to go on, and there are going to be reversals if we screw up with God and are unfaithful, and let's just try to keep it on track as long as we can. And then under the influence of Zoroastrianism, they had this periodization, this dispensationalizing of history. It's going to come to a particular end. Well, so preterism seems to drop the apocalyptic thing. Where is history going? Is there going to be, they're not like post-millennialists, like the Puritans who thought eventually, yes, Christ is going to come back and we're going to have a nice world to present to him. Well, here's the unintended consequence. They have supplied a striking parallel to the notion that Jesus was created because of the failure of the Messiah to come, that in difficult times, Jews were saying, when's he going to come? Look at all the terrible stuff we're going through. Please come, Maranatha, our Lord, come. And eventually they said, well, God's promises can't fail. Maybe it happened without us noticing it. Sure, that's it. And then that's the origin of it. Well, preterists have done the same thing. Wait a minute, it says this generation shall not pass, etc. And look at the calendar. It's been 2,000 years. Did God's promises fail? No. He must have come back. It was just that almost nobody noticed it. Yeah, that's it. It happened in 70 AD. And they're giving you a living example of what some scholars said caused the first coming to be created. So that's, I mean, I remember when that dawned on me, thanks, preterists.
Dr. Bob, this is funny because I was a full preterist. I was like I look at text, okay, and good old Christian Bible student I was, and I said, you know what? God's word will be true. Let every man be a liar. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Hallelujah. Mm-hmm. And so I went in there and I looked for these.
Can I get a witness?
I love this stuff though, because it's like the text does say there's a time cap, and there are like, this is what made me look at re-looking at how we date a lot of these texts. And a lot of it's speculative too here, because to me it's supposing things. We're supposing some of these things. I can delve into that. I don't want to rabbit trail too long, but long story short, I'm looking at these texts. This generation, you said, you would not even have gone through all the houses in Israel. There's so many little Matthew 16, some of you standing here will not taste death until you see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom to repay each man according to their deeds, which to me is the harvest. You got the wheat and the tare, you've got the sheep and the goat, you've got the final apocalypse, and that apocalypse was supposed to happen then at the 70 AD mark. And so these preterists, what happened when I started delving into this movement, there's so many branches in it, a variety from Church of Christ to Calvinistic preterist. You name it. There's so many offshoots. We can do a show on that someday and just kind of like discuss. But I got a couple books I definitely would like to throw your way, and you can literally see dude, if there's a perfect group for harmonization, these are the number one when it comes to reading. Anyone who wants to be a professional harmonizer, these guys are so harmonizing. They will redefine terms, in my opinion, to make it harmonize in such a manner that, for example, we'll go to 2 Peter, right? 2 Peter talks about the elements shall melt with fervent heat. Well, what are these elements? These are the elements of the temple elements, which is talking about the destruction of the Jerusalem temple and all the elements that are used in there. Now, could they be right? Maybe, but this is the point I'm trying to get at, is this elements, the temple elements, the melting of them? Oh, well, that's what happened. The burning of the city took place in 70 AD, and it all melted, and the heavens and the earth shall not pass away. Not one jot or tittle of the law shall pass, Jesus says, right? Well, the jot and tittle of the law did pass, and that's how the new heavens and new earth did come in. And it's not literal new heavens and new earth, they'll say. The heavens and earth, they reference an Old Testament Exodus passage where Moses calls out to the children of Israel and calls them heavens and earth. He calls them the heavens and the earth.
Mm.
So they use that language and say, this is a new people. The old heavens and old earth is the old covenant people. See how much and could they be right? Possibly, but there's so much.
Hard to
Yeah.
you would need more explanation of that on the page. I mean, that is desperate. Um, Whereas this guy Russell in the book The Parousia,
The Russell
etc.,
Brand.
from yeah, this guy refuses to do that. He is, I mean, somebody ought to give Diogenes this guy's phone number because he's looking for the one honest man. He is ruthless and scornful of people that say, well, maybe this generation means the generation that sees it will live to see it. Yeah,
Sorry, it
great.
was James
Or
Stewart
this
Russell.
race. Yeah, okay, yeah.
Sorry about that.
What a book. It is terrific. The only place I think he fudges it, and even here, it's not that outrageous. When he talks, he says it's something about how the world could mean, I mean, lexically, it could mean the land, and that Israel is the land in question. That seems unlikely to me, but it's not in the same ballpark with this generation dodges. And the idea that the Jesus did actually come back in 70 AD, and the people that saw it were raptured at the time, which is why there was such a huge fall off in quality of the Christians, because he's thinking like Paul was Martin Luther and Peter was John Calvin and so forth. But that struck me as highly unlikely, and yet you think he's coming like the thief in the night. Doesn't that kind of imply you're not going to say so? But that book is a paragon of honesty. I really got to hand it to that guy.
Yeah,
I don't know that he raised all of these questions that these people you're mentioning have to harmonize.
well, it's fascinating what you're saying here, because that's where we started. A lot of us started with being told, read James Stewart Russell. And I love the way they used to write. The old styles that people wrote, they cut through the bullshit, if you want my opinion. They really didn't, they didn't rabbit trail too often. They really did a very good job of saying what they are thinking and getting the point across. And he did a great job. He didn't go all the way, though. See, a lot of people who've read him, you would think he went all the way. When you start delving, there's that group I mentioned called Israel Only. Love these guys. I really do. They love to dig into the text and really try to make sense of some stuff, but they try to make sense of some stuff. And I mentioned how Gentiles were actually diaspora Jews or Israelites, according to the New Testament to them. And they'll use passages like Jesus came for the lost sheep of Israel. He came to save his people from their sins, and that he's only dying for his people's sins, just like the sacrifice in the Old Testament was only for Israel. Jesus came only for Israel. And so the world that is being saved and loved by God, John 3:16, for God so loved the world, here we are with the land, or at least the people of the land. This is talking about Israel. And so there's some interesting points they raise, which makes me think there might have been an early Edomite type style Christianity being touched on in these texts. But I'm fascinated because they'll take stuff and I say, look, I can't become what you are. They ask me this because obviously I'm not even, these guys are agnostic, some of them are atheists. They're IOers though. They say the text says this. It doesn't mean they believe Jesus really came. These guys went outside now. They've passed the full preterist and they said, look, this is what the text is saying. We don't believe it. We don't believe this stuff literally happened, but the text says what the text says. So we're gonna fill you in on what this story is saying. It seems like they're still using the same harmonization skills as a believer into the outside world. And I'm saying, guys, what if it doesn't harmonize? That's what I've been talking to you about. What if it doesn't harmonize? What if Paul was really saying, or whoever wrote Paul in Galatians chapter 3, whoever wrote that part, where he talks about Abraham being a blessing to all the nations. They interpret that to mean the 12 tribes. They literally say in Galatians 3, it means the 12 tribes are the nations that Abraham's blessing. And to me, it's like, well, to me, if you go back to Genesis, Israel didn't even exist according to the story. So he's going to be a blessing to his great, 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 great grandsons, children, who are then going to be split up into 12 tribes. It seems that Abraham was going to be a blessing to the world. And I think, this is just my opinion, I mentioned this to them before, just like the Muslims want Sharia to take over the world, they want to, they want to make this thing cover the earth. They want to be the full controllers, and that God or Allah will have them in command and everyone will be subservient to them or become one of them. The same thing with the Jews. The same concept was that the Jews are the apple of God's eye. They were going to rule the earth. Of course, speak to a Jew today who's an Orthodox Jew, they'll probably say, it's a peaceful thing. You'll want to serve us. You'll want to be part of what we're doing, not under sword, but because you'll see that we're doing the right thing and this and this and that. But they're still claiming that their God's going to make them the rulers of this earth and that everyone else would come to them. Therefore, they would be a blessing to the earth as children of Abraham. Where did this notion of Galatians 3 being what Paul or whoever wrote Paul saying become only the 12 tribes of Israel? That came when IO came on the scene. And IO's saying, I've never heard a scholar say that. That's why I was like, where are you guys coming up with this? Well, look at this reference in the gospel. And then look at this harmonization. It's a fascinating tool.
Do they think that if a biblical writer wanted to refer to non-Jewish nations, there would be any way grammatically or lexically to say it? Because they seem to be taking every apparent reference to that to mean, oh no, that's just part of the tribes of Israel or whatever. I mean, they seem to be willing to take it that way every time. So if you wanted to say there are Gentile nations that are not Jewish, you could say it even? I mean, it's like overkill.
Well, it's a good point. And I must say this before I give my response on that. I've watched them in many Facebook groups debate. And this isn't for everyone. So I'm not throwing everybody in the lump, especially if they're watching this, because some of them probably are fans of my show and they probably will watch. What I have noticed is if you suppose a certain place and they suppose it fits their idea of it has to be only biological Israelites, or if it's not biological Israelites and they say it's covenantal, which there's some that say it's not about the blood, it's about the wiener schnauzer, they call it, or they talk about circumcision, okay, that it has to do with Israel by covenant. They come at you pretty rough. I stopped debating theology around them because they hammer that, and they're like Martin Luther in the debate with John Calvin over the Lord's Supper. Is it consubstantiation or spiritual body? And this is my body, Martin Luther hitting the table. This is my body. It is his body. And he just wouldn't concede. Well, I stopped hearing the hammering of the fist on the table and said, I'm going to a different party. I just left it alone. And I still watch, though. I'm positive that they will say, don't put words into my mouth. Don't say that's what Israel only believes, because we don't believe that. They'll say there probably are references to non-Israelites. But if I use one, for example, like Jesus praising a Roman centurion, most likely, there are those who are going to go, no, that was an Israelite. He would not have said he had faith, greater faith than all who are in Israel, if he wasn't in Israel. Or they find a way to somehow make the Roman centurion or Cornelius or you name it, even the Gentile Titus, for example, who's uncircumcised, they'll claim he was a pagan Israelite. All the pagans were, if they're in the faith and they're actively participating in any way, shape, or form in the story, they are Israelite.
Are they like God-fearers? Would they have been circumcised and practicing Jews, proselytes?
That's a good question, because I've actually mentioned the God-fearing thing. We've had a show with James Stephen Valiant on this. We did a couple shows trying to get a discussion. There was a couple of them I wanted to have on the show because they're well-spoken. And they wouldn't come on the show, and they realize now where I'm coming from. Like, I'm not here to win an argument. I really want to find out what you think and why, and challenge those ideas together, not a debate. But they'll say, like, the God-fear section, like Cornelius was an Israelite. They believe he was an Israelite. Now, most of them believe this is genetic or biological. in some way. They're descendants, literally, from the nutsack. Now,
But
there are,
that is really stretching it.
right, and then there are those, though, that take a covenantal stance, like Jason DaCosta, who has a YouTube channel, talks about it, and he does a lot of expository stuff on his channel discussing these texts. He says it's covenantal, and it isn't biological necessarily. They become an Israelite by faith, and outsiders could join. But he does, this is where they differ from the norm, like what scholarship would suppose. When you get to the New Testament, they say the old covenant Israelites, whether they were people that were foreigners and they weren't biological and they joined, were the only ones who were allowed to enter into the new covenant, and that the doors closed to the new covenant at 70 AD. So between 30 to 33-ish to 70, 73-ish, in that 40-year span, that's when the 1,000-year reign really began, that idea of revelation. So they harmonize all this, and they say it's a metaphorical number, not literal, and they speculate that the new covenant was a 40-year generation that took place that was pretty much this idea of the ark, Noah's ark. Get in before the flood happens, and that's when the rapture happens in 70, according to the text. So everybody needed to get on the ark of salvation in Jesus Christ from the old covenant, crossing the Red Sea, so to speak, metaphorically, enter into the new covenant, and off to outer space you go, get to rest with the Lord Jesus Christ forever, and pretty much the doors are closed. There's no more salvation needed because they were saved only from the old covenant law. The law is what brought death, or I'm sorry, let me not mess that up. I don't want to put words in their mouth, but pretty much the law is what brought guilt and shame, and that the law is what had to end, and the law was ended at 70 AD with the destruction of the temple, and all of its elements are done away with. Therefore, you can get the gist of where I'm going with this. So anyone after 70 AD that practices Christianity, they say, technically, you're a poser. You're trying to be something that was never yours. The contemporary audience of these texts are where this comes in. And I said, what about these texts that were written well after the destruction of the temple? Why would anyone have written these things if they weren't? And if you ask a believing preterist this question, Dr. Bob, a believing full preterist who believes in Jesus Christ as his own Lord and Savior, what if some of these texts were written after 70? 99% literally say, nope, internal evidence. They stick to trying to see how the text predicts, like the Gospels, like a typical Christian would say, well, Jesus didn't lie. He was predicting the temple. That had to be written before because he said it was going to happen. If it's going to happen, that means it hasn't happened. So it had to be written before. Well, they do that all the way through the epistles, all the way through the text, everywhere. And they use internal evidence to prove that dating had to be before 70. When you come to scholarship like you said, look, there's some of this shit written in 160, 170. I mean, when you get into the letters and stuff. And why would it be written, I asked these guys. We haven't really hurdled that, but I've seen some of them deconstruct, and they're starting to see, like Bart Ehrman. Even Bart Ehrman's a breath of fresh air from that. And he takes you and shows you the forged, and in his text, he proves a lot of this stuff is like, guys, they did this a lot. They did a lot of forging and a lot of text stuff like this. So, yeah, I don't know if I've ever explained this to you like that, but I'm glad to let you get a little bit more.
That is exceedingly weird. I try not to discount things because they're unfamiliar to me. I try to look into them, but that sounds like there's a lot of real text twisting going on. John A.T. Robinson, back in the late 70s, wrote a book called Redating the New Testament, where he tried to show that there's no real reason to date any of the New Testament after 70. But it seemed pretty contrived. Again, it's not an insane view, but it makes certain strange assumptions, like failing to take into account the idea of vaticinia ex eventu, predictions, quote unquote, after the fact, and how common that was. So it seemed, I almost get the impression he was just arguing that way to ruffle the feathers of his colleagues, but It sounds like the same kind of move that Calvinists make when they say, "For God so loved the world." Well, of course, the world means believers in Christ. What? It seems absurd, but they have to say it because they have to think that everything agrees. You pointed out the thing with you shall in John 10, Matthew 10, you will not have finished. When they persecute you in one town, flee to the next. For I tell you, you will not have finished going through the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. Yeah, that is certainly a vestige of the Ebionite style Jewish Christianity that did not think Christianity was for the Gentiles, which, by the way, doesn't mean they condemned them to hell necessarily. Joachim Jeremias argues in a book called Jesus. Message to the nations, something like that. If he had in mind Micah and Isaiah, he figured that at the end the doors would be open to the nations. They wouldn't have to worry about that, and so that Jesus doesn't necessarily, he doesn't say, he doesn't necessarily mean, well, you have to leave the rest of them to go get their asbestos underwear because they're all going to hell. Um, and it seems to me very clear that what you have in Matthew is two different evangelistic commissions. One of them is represents the opponents of Peter after he went to see Cornelius. And he says, wait a minute, you went to Gentiles? Are you out of your mind? He says, look, I know what you mean. I used to think the same thing, but here's what happened. He said, son of a gun, I guess God has opened the door to repentance of the Gentiles. Well, that's all about this debate. And that Matthew 10, that was the great commission of that faction. But then when after the transition to, yeah, Gentiles too, then you get the Great Commission in chapter 28. And since both factions, actually three, were still in Antioch, where I think Matthew was written, you have a compromised document in this gospel that has bits and pieces representing different factions in the community. One that still didn't want Gentiles to be brought aboard, another that did, and further. So both are embedded because both were sacred to somebody in the audience. And so, yeah, it did mean that it's only for Israel. And so that's you're right. You cannot really harmonize this, and they're crippled by this idea that there can't be any contradictions. Whereas we know that you ask why there are contradictions and what that implies about the readers and the writers and all that. They're great. I mean, you want the contradictions because they're big clues to unlock the thing. It's not just stupid mistakes, which people seem to think. That is not the idea at all. Oh boy. Anyway, and now
Yeah.
what they're doing by seizing on these strange sounding passages that don't get a lot of airplay in conventional Christian theology, they're doing something very good methodologically. Thomas Kuhn talks about this in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, where he says that science has not proceeded so much by finding new data. I mean, that happens too, but rather it's progressed by a succession of paradigms, that new frameworks for understanding. Like that's why they abandoned Ptolemaic astronomy with the Earth in the center. Copernicus realized you could calculate the motions of the heavenly bodies more easily and naturally if you assume the sun is in the center, and so on and so forth. And eventually he showed how that made more sense, and everybody reluctantly said, I guess he's right. And now that's orthodoxy. Well, and he says, you see what's happening here? Somebody is saying the conventional view doesn't know what to make of this anomalous data, as he calls it. So somebody will come along and say, suppose we start with the anomalous data, see what they seem to mean, and see if perhaps they suggest a new paradigm to put the whole darn thing together. Sometimes it works, and that's what they're trying to do. It's just not every attempt is successful, but that is what they're trying to do, and good for them.
I actually have to agree, because I didn't want to come off facetious. In fact, within the paradigm that they're working with, it makes sense. But when you think the way that they're thinking, because there's certain terms you really have to look at. Like, for example, you brought up John 3:16. I'm going to tell you an example. They're very sharp. I mean, I would love to have a book written by one of them that really explains this, so I can give it to you. But I've already been in the works trying to talk to some of them about, hey, let's get one of you guys come on with Dr. Bob, because if there's a scholar who's open to talking about these things, you're definitely one of them. One of the things that they would say, for example, John 3:16, look at the context, right? That's what any Christian always tries to say. But nonetheless, the point is, these guys aren't coming at it like that. They're saying, let's scientifically look at this. Who's Jesus talking to? Nicodemus, a high teacher of Israel. Ah, okay. So it's in the context of Jesus talking to Israel, or an Israelite, and he's speaking in terms of Israel. And he's delving into the context. When he says, for God so loved the world, one can take the idea he's speaking of planet Earth and every person on Earth. One could take that notion, or another one could say, hey, in the context of him talking to an Israelite, here he is explaining what world really means. We're in the story.
Why would you use such a word?
I know.
I mean, it's so misleading. Because what's anybody going to think world means?
Right.
It just seems.
Well, let me give you another example and tell me what you think of this. Because full preterists use this argument. I heard this years ago when I became one. You tell me your thoughts. So we know that the gospel, according to Matthew, Luke, Mark, the idea that the end is this coming of the destruction of the temple. You got Matthew 24, Luke 17, Mark 13 is talking about this temple, right? And Jesus shows them all the things of the temple. Then he goes to tell them, these will be the signs of his coming and the end. He says that the gospel would be preached in the whole world. All right. The oikumene, I believe it is in Greek, if I'm not mistaken. Paul, this is what's very fascinating about this. It says in one of Paul's epistles, I can Google it for you real quick. I think it's Colossians.
It's in Colossians, right? The gospel that has been preached.
In the whole world. Now, we know that wasn't preached literally in the whole world, but what if world meant Roman Empire? Just like Luke chapter 2, 1? Yeah, maybe he sent out a tax to the whole world. Now, we know that he didn't tax China. You know what I mean? He taxed the Roman Empire and those who were obviously affiliated or under its rule. So could world mean a limit within a bubble? And that's kind of, I think, where they're coming with this, is that Paul preached the gospel to the whole world already, or it had been preached to the whole world, this idea that the gospel had been preached to the whole oikumene. Is this oikumene Israel? Is this oikumene the Roman Empire? This is kind of the notion that preterists will say, is that you can't just say absolutely it's universal and applicable to any and all. Like all doesn't mean all the time, kind of like those type of things. You know what I mean?
Well, though, with the is tax for the whole world, the context tells you what it means. Literally, geez, I'm not with it today. Ecumene, whatever. It means the inhabited house, and like the home economics, the administration of your home, and all that. Well, it's important to know, as they would have known, that it doesn't mean Mongolia and Swaziland and stuff like that, because everybody knew who the Romans could tax and not tax. They knew that Judas of Galilee's revolt was due to the fact that Rome formally incorporated Judah into the Roman Empire, which it had not been in Herod's day. So there hadn't been any Roman taxation, while Herod was a client king, technically independent. But now it was a province of Rome, and so Rome collected taxes, and Judas and his buddies were not having that. They said, we're not doing that because God is our king. I mean, there's enough context there to see that it couldn't mean the whole world. To, however, say that that the fact that in certain contexts it might be more metaphorical without giving a reason why it would be here, other than your theology. That seems to me to make it stretched. The thing with Colossians, that is really interesting because he might simply mean the Roman Empire, but it's a little difficult. I mean, if he did, that really shoves Colossians way later, because you're assuming that their church is in Britain and so forth. There weren't yet, but that one is more puzzling. But the thing with Nicodemus, that just seems they're really stretching it. Words can mean anything in that context. And that's why I say that's a piece of anomalous data for their paradigm.
Right.
And it sort of should send you back to the drawing board.
I can respect that because you bring up some fascinating points. I like to listen to both sides. This is why I wanted, I'm very lucky. I get to sit on my chair and watch you guys wrestle. You know what I mean? And the cool thing was I watched James Stephen Valiant. He came on and we got a lot of messages and text and stuff. I wanted more dialogue. I like to hear people talk these ideas out because both sides are not like, we have to be right for faith reasons. It's more of an intellectual wrestling pit. And so what I liked is that James Stephen Valiant, he points out that in like Matthew, what we see is actually a slap in the face, so to speak. You would say that Matthew, for example, is the most Jewish gospel. Okay, I would agree that if you look at it, but he actually shows like over and over, like we talked about Matthew 10, where when he approaches the Roman centurion, what would it do to your theology if you're Israel only? And you find out that this isn't an Israelite, this Roman centurion, and he says to this guy, listen, they're not even going to be seated at Abraham's table.
Yeah.
We're going to take on a new people. That would be a slap in Israel's face. Now, that would technically redefine Israel if for some reason we find out, hey, look, starting from the scratch board, look, God can make these stones turn into sons of God. Well, we can start over. And that's what I think James Stephen Valiant was saying, and why Jesus is really blowing Nicodemus's mind in the story is because he's doing something so new and so different. And that could be the context as well. So I'm pulled back and forth, and I love it. I love it because it tells me they're both so right in their own mind. And I get to sit back and go, you know what? At least I know that nobody really knows. So that's cool to me. I don't know why. That's amazing.
There's diversity today, and I wouldn't want to see it end. I hope these guys don't get convinced that they're wrong. I just find it fascinating. Keep going. But they assume that there wasn't diversity in early Christianity. Everybody must have agreed on this, whereas no. Ernst Käsemann wrote this great essay years ago when the World Council of Churches asked him to write something on the New Testament canon and the unity of the church, and he winds up right out of the gate saying, it's not about the unity of the church because the New Testament is not united, because every sect has its own square foot of ground in the canon. And bingo. I mean, obviously, why? Well, the reason they assume it all agrees is they think it's infallible scripture, and that God wouldn't allow this. Well, like Clark Pennock, sort of a radical evangelical, said, the fundamentalists don't like the Bible they've got. They're trying to make it over into something else, and I don't know that they're fooling anybody.
Dr. Bob, man, I love you. I love this. Hey, if you're watching this, first off, I want to say thank you for being a fan of MythVision and what we do. I mentioned this in my last video. We don't always agree with everything our guests bring on the table. This is intellectual stimulation. To me, it's to
Yeah.
free people from the box, in my opinion. Regardless if
Mm.
you're a theist, atheist, agnostic, it doesn't matter to me. And then all the other categories out there, I don't care. That doesn't matter to me. What matters is that we're not stuck thinking one idea. And to me, there's freedom in knowing that we know enough to know that nobody absolutely knows. And I
Mm.
personally find freedom in that, and it's a lot less pressure thinking I have to have everything right. Look, ladies and gentlemen, please go to Robert M. Price. Is it mindvendor.com?
Yeah, though I think there's another version of the site that is just robert.m.price.com, but the Mind Vendor one would give you the option to go into that one, and they're still in the works. We have a new guy coming on to revamp the whole website, but the stuff is there between those two
I'll put
addresses
both
now.
links up then. Please do me a favor. Anyone who's watching this, yes, I would love to have you guys donate to me on PayPal so we can make another show with him and Dr. Carrier happen. But if you would do me a huge favor, I'm a huge fan of Dr. Bob. I send him donations from time to time just to get him to come on here. Go to his PayPal, become a Patreon member. It's not expensive to be a monthly subscriber. How much is it?
Oh, $1 if you want. I have unbelievably generous people that give more every month, but it's just $1. And if all the people that watch that listen to the Bible Geek, for instance, did that, my problems would be over.
That'd be great if you guys could become a patron and also show him a one-time donation in the PayPal. Help him out. Buy his books. All that stuff helps him out. I am obviously going to need to get more of your books. I'm pushing Dr. Bob to possibly one day, and I know this is a headache by saying this, possibly doing an audio book for his amazing colossal apostle. But maybe he gets enough funds down the road and he can do it for people like me. Thank you for joining me. Please, guys, help him out. Go in the description down right now. Hit that like, hit that subscribe button. Get the bell so you guys are notified every time we drop a bomb, because that's just what we do at MythVision. And go show Dr. Price some love. I mean, I can't ask you enough. Like, this is your 10% tithe hat. It's being passed around right now. Give to God's people. You know what I mean?
Hallelujah.
I love you. Thank you so much for joining me, guys. And any closing words you'd like to say, Dr. Bob?
Yeah, I just did an interview yesterday with people that are working on a documentary with Valiant and Fahey and Joe Atwill and me and others about mythicism and the, as I like to call it, the Flavian hypothesis. And I don't know when it's going to be done. I'm sure it'll take a long time. But I also was notified that in late November, the director of the Gospel According to Price is supposed to come down here from Canada and tape the last segment of it. And it was a few years ago when I went up to Canada to do the first two that are on YouTube now, but they're finally going to finish it up. And I'll have to see if I can lose more weight before that happens, because in the first two sections, I look like Jabba the Hutt. And
No.
to get a little healthier.
Hey, everybody's been complimenting me, complimenting you about losing weight. They can tell that you've lost weight. I don't know what you're doing,
Me
but
neither.
it's working.
It's the weirdest thing. I'm thinking tapeworms, maybe, because my my appetite has changed without trying. I'm just lucky.
Good for you, Dr. Bob. You look a lot better, honestly, and it's
Oh,
helping
thanks.
you, really. You really are. So
Mm.
thank you for joining me, brother. And look, I'm going to bug you. I'm going to end up having you back on here soon. So
Sure. Well,
appreciate you
loads of
guys.
fun.
Later.
Yeah.